ready for a deep dive into something really fascinating. We're going to be tracing the roots of how the serpent went from a Garden of Eden resident, right, to this ultimate symbol of evil, Satan. And we've got some pretty intriguing articles to help us unpack all this.
Sounds like a winding path.
It really is. And it all begins with, honestly, a pretty surprising fact. This Biblical Archaeology Society piece points out there's no devil, like capital D devil, in the original Garden of Eden story.
Yeah, it's easy to think that whole image, the serpent and Eve, has always been tied to the devil.
Right.
But that whole concept of Satan as this, singular evil being didn't even exist when those first Hebrew texts were written. The serpent in the garden, it was just a serpent.
Okay, so that has me rethinking, everything Sunday school taught me. How do we get from regular snake, even a kind of crafty one, to the Prince of Darkness with the horns and pitchfork?
It's a long story. A lot of it boils down to how ancient cultures viewed snakes way differently than I think a lot of us do now.
That's true. Like those Naga, they're from Hindu mythology, right?
Yeah.
Often thought of as these benevolent beings, half human, half snake. They're tied to water, royalty. Yeah. Not exactly the devil incarnate, are they?
Not quite.
We'll circle back to those guys later on, I bet. They're fascinating.
They really are. They provide a great contrast point when we look at how the serpent evolved in those Abrahamic traditions. What's key to remember is, for a lot of those older cultures, serpents were often linked to deities, to royalty, even fertility. Powerful, sure, but not always automatically bad guys.
Okay, so no devil in the garden initially, but we do see that word Satan pop up in the Bible, don't we?
We do, yeah. And that's where this whole evolution of the serpent story gets really interesting, because that Hebrew word Satan, it actually just means adversary or even accuser. It wasn't this name so much as a more general term.
So more like cosmic prosecuting attorney.
Yeah, there you go.
And I'm thinking about that part in the Biblical Archaeology Society article, how even God interacts with the Satans in the book of Job. They have a wager going on.
Exactly.
Not exactly the actions of some evil mastermind out to corrupt all of humanity, right?
And that difference really shows how differently that whole concept was viewed way back then. If you look at the books of Numbers, Job, Zechariah, Satan is used for human figures, divine figures. Yeah. Basically anyone acting in opposition, but in very specific situations.
So if Satan started as this general term, adversary, how does it become the Satan, like the ultimate baddie? Is it a straight line from that first serpent?
Not quite a straight line. A lot of it has to do with these big cultural shifts and, honestly, a rise in apocalyptic anxieties that happened in the centuries after the Hebrew Bible was written.
Here come the angels, the demon, the whole end of the world fears. Makes you wonder how our anxieties now will color how future folks see us, right?
It's definitely something to think about, but Jewish thought was going through a lot of development in those centuries. Those beliefs in angels, demons, this final battle between good and evil, it all really takes hold. And that's when we see the Garden of Eden story getting revisited a lot, reinterpreted.
So as people get more afraid of evil, afraid of the end times, they start looking back at that serpent in the garden with a whole new set of anxieties.
Precisely. And the serpent, it starts to become this symbol for this powerful, tempting force leading humanity astray. It becomes a representation of those anxieties.
So the serpent goes from being just some creature in the garden to representing something much bigger, much scarier. But how did that line up with Satan still being this, general adversary at that point? Was there a direct connection, or did things get kind of jumbled?
Well, it's interesting, right? The serpent's definitely getting a more ominous makeover, but it wasn't always directly linked to the name Satan. Like, we were talking about Satan as this general adversary, but that Biblical Archaeology Society article, it mentions the Book of 1 Enoch, and in that one, it's Gadriel who led Eve astray.
Gadriel. Sounds like a mythological heavy hitter. See, that really shows how these stories, they weren't fixed, right? Different figures could get attached to a similar idea.
Exactly. And we even do it today, don't we? People try to reinterpret things like Ezekiel's vision in the Bible through the lens of, UFOs.
Right.
Makes you realize how much our current anxieties, our interests, it all colors how we look back at the past.
It's like those old combat myths. Marduk versus Tiamat, Baal battling Yam. Often the serpent represents that chaos, that disorder. But it's not always Satan, even if the imagery kind of rhymes,
Exactly. And that imagery becomes more and more important as we move into early Christianity. That's where the concept of Satan as this one singular entity opposed to God, it really solidifies.
Okay, so drawing on those earlier traditions, we talked about all those apocalyptic fears.
Okay.
And as that image of Satan the ultimate enemy as that gets locked in. Well, the serpent goes from garden resident to public enemy number one.
Uh-huh.
But before we go full-on Abrahamic with it, I'm really curious about those Naga you mentioned.
Oh, yeah. Let's loop back to them. Because the Naga, there's such a cool contrast. They really embody this whole different perspective on serpent deities, way more nuanced, way more multifaceted, and in many traditions, even benevolent.
It's like we're comparing apples to something that could eat an apple orchard in one bite.
Yeah.
We were saying before, Naga, they're not your typical villain. Powerful beings, half human, half serpent, that link to water, to royalty, guardianship. It's not all like temptation and downfall with these guys. They represent a much bigger spread of.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what makes comparing these different traditions so interesting. While they could be dangerous, Naga weren't inherently evil. Many cultures revered them, protectors of sacred places, possessors of wisdom, even guides to, hidden knowledge.
And they've got their own awesome underworld realm.
Right.
Patala. Not exactly the lake of fire we tend to associate with the devil.
Different vibe. Those excerpts on Patala, they describe a place of incredible beauty, wealth, things like shimmering jewels, lush gardens, these palaces you wouldn't believe.
Less fiery pit, more like opulent paradise. Even the trip there, those excerpts mention hidden caves, waterways, all guarded by these fearsome but often benevolent serpent beings. It's giving like Indiana Jones meets the ancient serpent guardians of a magical realm.
It's easy to get caught up in the imagery. But what's really interesting is that those descriptions of Patala, they highlight how it's not just some physical location. It also represents a realm of esoteric knowledge power.
Okay, now you're speaking my language. Esoteric knowledge, serpent wisdom. Give me the details. What's the connection between these Naga and the unseen world?
In some traditions, Naga, they're believed to be masters of alchemy, magic, guardians of ancient wisdom, not just gold and gems, but secret knowledge passed down throughout the ages. It's a very different picture from that serpent offering forbidden fruit, right?
Night and day. So on one hand, we've got these powerful, complex serpent beings, and then on the other, there's that image of Satan solidifying as the ancient serpent. How does Christianity square those two very different takes?
Right. And like a lot of things, it's complicated. But one thing that's super important to remember, the Bible itself never explicitly says that Garden of Eden serpent is Satan.
So that connection was made later on, maybe as those apocalyptic anxieties ramped up and people were rereading those older texts. Less direct line from Eden to Dante's Inferno, more like creative reimagining.
Exactly. That Biblical Archaeology Society piece made a good point. The author of Revelation, they referred to Satan as that ancient serpent, right? But they suggest it's probably more likely a reference to things like Leviathan, those big chaos serpents from ancient Near Eastern myths.
Yeah.
Not just some regular snake.
So we're saying the Bible doesn't actually connect that garden serpent with Satan. It sounds like that whole thing came together later, pulling in those older mythical images, the chaos serpents, all that.
Yeah, it's really wild how those ancient stories, those images, they just weave their way through history, taking on these new meanings in different contexts. It's not just about a literal snake anymore. It becomes this huge symbol. And all those anxieties about evil, the end of the world, they're all wound up in it.
And serpents, well, they kind of get under your skin, don't they? Even today. It's primal, almost. I mean, think about it. Some folks are terrified of snakes. Some are totally drawn to them.
For sure. It's like those gut reactions, fear, fascination, maybe that goes all the way back to those old stories, to the power of what they represent,
We went from serpent as crafty trickster to serpent as chaos itself, and then boom, serpent is the ultimate evil, at least in Christianity. Mm-hmm. But then there are all these cultures, especially over in Asia, where serpents, those Naga we talked about, they're totally different.
I know. That contrast is really something. In a lot of those Asian traditions, serpents are these incredibly powerful beings, but also often they're connected to wisdom, protection, even divinity. They're not just there to mess things up or tempt you. They're part of how the whole world works, part of the fabric of their beliefs.
It's like those amazing temples in Thailand, Cambodia. You've got those incredible Naga all over them. Magnificent guardians. They're seen as protectors of water. They bring the rain, fertility. That's a far cry from the serpent waiting to drag you down to hell.
Absolutely. It shows how even the most powerful symbols, they can be interpreted in all these different ways depending on the culture, the time period. What gets me is how these totally different takes on serpents, they actually show us different ways of seeing the world, seeing ourselves in it.
Okay, so break that down for me. What can we learn about, human nature just by thinking about how we view serpents?
Well, on one side, you have that image of the serpent as the tempter, the deceiver, leading humanity astray from what's good and right. It kind of suggests this anxiety about who we are deep down, our desires, and how they might lead us to bad places.
Like projecting that whole good versus evil battle onto one powerful creature.
Totally. But on the flip side, you've got cultures that don't just fear serpents, they revere them. Powerful allies, sources of wisdom, guardians of sacred knowledge. It's like they've made peace with those primal forces, you know? They get that nature can be dangerous and they give life. It's less about fighting against it, more about understanding it, respecting its power, and finding a way to live alongside it.
So we've gone from sneaky snake to chaos serpents to wise guardian, all in one creature.
It's amazing, right? How powerful symbols are, how their meanings can change so much. In the end, I think what we decide a serpent means says more about us, our fears, our hopes, than it does about actual snakes.
That's a great point to end on, I think. Just goes to show, always more than one way to look at things, especially these ancient myths, symbols. But I've got one last thought for you out there listening as we wrap up this deep dive. We spent all this time on how a serpent became Satan, how that idea stuck. But we can't forget about those cultures where serpents were never purely evil. So here's something to chew on. Could it be that our fear of snakes, even the devil himself, it all comes from a much deeper fear? Fear of the unknown, the power of nature, maybe even our own mortality. Think about it. Thanks for joining us on this seriously serpentoid journey today. Until next time, keep exploring your world and all the mysteries beyond it.